Hello, friend. This is the story of a pregnant woman, Lita. What happened to her when a police officer hit in her belly? So get started. The sun was already high above the city of Braxton when Lita Monroe stepped out of her small apartment on Maple Street. She was 27, radiant, and 7 months pregnant with her first child, a daughter she had already named Amara. Lita hummed a soft melody as she walked toward the bus stop, one hand resting protectively over her round belly. Life hadn't always been kind to her, but lately, there was hope. She worked as a librarian's assistant at the local community center. It wasn't glamorous, and the pay was modest, but the people there treated her with kindness and dignity, something that had often felt scarce for a black woman in a city still grappling with its own shadows of prejudice. Her partner, Malik, worked double shifts at the auto plant, and often reminded her that they were building a future not just for themselves, but for the little girl who kicked gently inside her every morning. The day began like any other, but it would end with a tragedy that would ripple through the city, the courts, and the nation. The trouble started just before noon. Lita was leaving the pharmacy, a small paper bag of prenatal vitamins in her hand, when she heard raised voices from across the street. A police cruiser was parked haphazardly at the curb, lights flashing. Two officers were confronting a young black teenager, barely 16, who stood trembling with his hands raised. Lita didn't know what had happened, but she recognized the fear in the boy's eyes. She had seen that same fear too many times. "Stay back, ma'am," one officer barked at the small crowd gathering. His name tag read James Holbrook, a man known in the neighborhood for his harsh methods and quick temper. Lita's instinct was to walk away. She was pregnant, after all. But when the boy shouted, "I didn't do anything," and James shoved him hard against the wall, something in her heart refused to stay silent. "Please," Lita called out, stepping forward cautiously. "He's just a kid, you don't need to hurt him." James turned sharply, eyes narrowing. "I said step back." "I am stepping back," she replied, hands raised. "I'm just asking you to be careful." For a moment, it seemed like he would ignore her. But then the boy cried out as James twisted his arm, and Lita's maternal instincts overcame her fear. She moved one step closer, holding out a hand. "Please, officer, he's back off." James's voice was low and dangerous now, but Lita didn't see the danger until it was too late. The officer spun around suddenly, frustration etched into every muscle of his face. He stepped toward her, too close, too fast, and before anyone could process what was happening, his boot shot forward and connected with her abdomen. The world froze. There was no sound, no thought, just a sharp, devastating pain that radiated through her entire body. Lita gasped, clutching her belly as she collapsed onto the sidewalk. The crowd screamed. Someone shouted for an ambulance. James took a step back, his expression shifting from anger to sudden horror. Lita's last memory before darkness claimed her was the faint, desperate flutter of Amara's heartbeat inside her, a heartbeat that seemed to falter and fade as the sirens wailed in the distance. The next time Lita opened her eyes, the world was sterile and white. A rhythmic beep echoed in her ears. She tried to speak, but her throat was dry. Panic surged as she remembered. The kick, the pain, the fall. "Amara," she whispered hoarsely. A nurse rushed to her side. "Lita, don't try to move. You're in St. Mary's Hospital." "Amara," she repeated, tears burning in her eyes. "My baby, is she okay?" The nurse's eyes flickered with something that wasn't quite sorrow, but wasn't hope either. "I'm going to get the doctor." The seconds stretched into centuries before Dr. Nguyen stepped in, her expression heavy with the kind of compassion that only comes before unbearable news. "Lita," she began softly, pulling up a chair beside the bed. "I'm so sorry." The world shattered. The rest of the doctor's words blurred into meaningless noise. Words like trauma, complications, no heartbeat. They floated through the air, but none of them could fill the void opening inside her chest. Amara was gone. The days that followed were a haze of grief and numbness. Malik stayed by her side, holding her hand as she cried herself empty. The community rallied around them. Strangers sent flowers. Neighbors left meals at their door. But nothing could erase the memory of that moment on the sidewalk. Nothing could undo the horror of losing a child before she even had a chance to breathe. And nothing could bring justice. Not yet. Officer James Holbrook was placed on paid administrative leave, a phrase that sounded like mockery every time Lita heard it on the news. Police spokespeople called the incident a tragic accident. They claimed Lita moved toward the officer in an aggressive manner, and he feared for his safety. Aggressive? She thought bitterly. A 7-month pregnant woman? Her grief soon turned into something sharper, something colder. It was no longer enough to mourn. She wanted accountability. She wanted the world to look at what happened and call it what it was, murder. And she wasn't alone. The video, shaky phone footage captured by a bystander, surfaced days later and spread like wildfire. Millions watched in horror as James's boot connected with Lita's belly. Millions listened to her scream. Protests erupted across Braxton and beyond. For once, it seemed, the tide of public opinion was on the side of justice. A week after Amara's funeral, a tiny casket Lita could barely bring herself to look at. The district attorney announced that Officer James Holbrook was being charged with manslaughter, aggravated assault, and wrongful death of an unborn child. But Lita knew this was only the beginning. The road to justice would be long, brutal, and filled with attempts to discredit her, to diminish her pain, to excuse the inexcusable. But she also knew one thing with unwavering certainty. She would not rest until the man who took her daughter's life was held accountable. Not just for Amara, but for every woman, every mother, and every black life that had been silenced before hers. The courtroom smelled faintly of disinfectant and old wood, a sterile, heavy scent that clung to the air like sorrow. Lita had never set foot inside a courthouse before. Now, she found herself seated in the front row of the gallery, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, staring at the man who had changed her life forever. Officer James Holbrook sat at the defense table, flanked by 2 attorneys in tailored suits. He looked smaller than she remembered, his uniform replaced by a plain gray suit, his once confident posture hunched and uneasy. But when his eyes flickered toward her, there was no remorse in them, only a cold, simmering resentment. The preliminary hearing had drawn a swarm of reporters and protesters alike. Signs reading "Justice for Lita" and "Say her name" lined the courthouse steps. For weeks, Braxton had been a city divided. Some people demanded Holbrook's immediate conviction, while others insisted he was just doing his job. Lita tuned out the noise. This wasn't about politics. It wasn't about police unions or public opinion. This was about Amara. The prosecution began with the video, shaky, grainy footage from a bystander's phone, but clear enough to capture the moment that would haunt Lita for the rest of her life. The courtroom fell silent as the recording played on the overhead screen. "Please, officer, he's back off." Then, the kick. The sound, a dull, sickening thud, echoed through the room. Lita closed her eyes as the image of herself collapsing replayed. She had begged her attorney not to show the footage, but he explained it was necessary. The jury needed to see. The judge needed to see. The world needed to see. "This was no accident," said Elena Ruiz, the lead prosecutor, her voice steady and sharp as glass. Officer Holbrook was not under attack. He was not in imminent danger. He was frustrated, and he chose to use his badge and his authority to inflict violence on a woman who posed no threat. Ruiz turned to the jury, her gaze unwavering. The result of that decision was the death of an unborn child, a death that never should have happened. James's defense attorney, a man named Clifford Mays, countered with the expected narrative, the chaos of the moment, James's supposed fear for his safety, Lita's sudden approach. They painted her as reckless, emotional, even partially responsible for what happened. The words burned like acid in her chest. "Mrs. Monroe," Mays said during cross-examination, his tone dripping with false sympathy. "You were aware that police situations can be dangerous, correct?" "Yes," Lita replied softly. "And yet you chose to approach Officer Holbrook while he was engaged with a suspect?" "I asked him not to hurt a child," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "That's all I did." "Did you ignore his repeated instructions to step back?" I didn't ignore. I was pleading for humanity. Mays smiled faintly, as if he'd caught her in a trap. But you did, in fact, take a step closer to him. I took a step closer to stop a boy from being brutalized. Lita snapped, the weight of her anger finally breaking through. And for that, I lost my daughter. The courtroom fell silent. Even James shifted uneasily in his seat. Outside the courthouse, the protests grew larger. People chanted Amara's name, carried candles, and held vigils. Activists from across the country arrived in Braxton, calling for police accountability and legislative reform. Lita became an unwilling symbol, her face appearing on magazine covers, her name trending on social media. But behind the public spotlight, her nights were still filled with silence and grief. She woke often from nightmares, reaching instinctively for the swell of her belly that was no longer there. Malik tried to be her anchor, but he was drowning too. They rarely spoke about the future anymore. The nursery they had painted together, soft lavender walls, a tiny white crib, remained untouched. Sometimes Lita would sit there in the dark, rocking in the chair meant for midnight feedings, whispering lullabies into the emptiness. One evening, her mother, Evelyn, came over with a pot of soup and a fierce determination that only mothers possess. "Baby," she said gently, taking Lita's hands in hers, "you have to remember why you're fighting." "I know," Lita whispered. "I just don't know if I have the strength." "You do," Evelyn said firmly. "You have the strength of every woman who ever had her voice taken from her. And you're not just fighting for Amara. You're fighting so no one else's child has to die like this." Lita nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. Her mother was right. This was bigger than her pain, bigger than her loss. This was about justice, and she would see it through, no matter how long it took. The trial date was set for late autumn. By then, the story had become a national scandal. Congressional hearings were convened. Civil rights organizations filed amicus briefs. The governor of the state even issued a public statement condemning the gross miscarriage of justice. Through it all, James remained defiant. He refused to apologize. He refused to testify. He even refused to look at Lita when she took the stand again during the trial's opening week. "Do you feel any remorse?" Ruiz asked him during cross-examination. James stared straight ahead. "I did what I was trained to do. You were trained to kick an unarmed pregnant woman. I was trained to neutralize threats." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Lita stared at him, her heart pounding with disbelief. Even now, after everything, he saw her as a threat. Not a woman, not a mother, just another target. The prosecution's case was devastating. Expert witnesses testified that Lita posed no danger. Medical professionals explained that Amara's death was a direct result of blunt force trauma. Even the police department's internal affairs unit, usually protective of its own, admitted that James had violated multiple protocols. Still, the defense clung to their argument that James had made a split-second decision under intense circumstances. They pleaded for leniency, citing his years of service and the absence of prior disciplinary action. But there was one thing they hadn't counted on: the jury. For 3 weeks, they sat in that courtroom, watching and listening. They saw the video. They heard the testimony. They felt the weight of Lita's loss in every tear she shed on the witness stand. And when they returned with a verdict, their decision was unanimous. Guilty, on all counts. The judge, a stern woman named Honorable Mariah Spencer, did not mince words at sentencing. "Officer Holbrook," she said, her voice echoing through the silent courtroom, "you swore an oath to protect and serve. Instead, you abused your authority in the most unconscionable way. Your actions resulted in the death of an innocent child and inflicted immeasurable pain on this mother and her family." She paused, her gaze cold and resolute. "This court finds your conduct to be so egregious, so malicious, that the maximum penalty under the law is not only warranted, it is necessary." Lita held her breath as the words fell like stones. "You are hereby sentenced to death by lethal injection." The room exploded into gasps and cries. Lita felt Malik's hand grip hers, trembling. James's face drained of color as the reality sank in. For the first time since that terrible day, Lita felt something that almost resembled peace. It wasn't happiness. It wasn't closure. But it was justice. 3 months had passed since the verdict, and winter had settled over Braxton like a heavy blanket. Snow fell silently over the courthouse steps where protesters still gathered, though their chants were quieter now. Not angry, but solemn, reflective. The trial was over. The sentence had been delivered. Yet for Lita Monroe, justice did not feel like an ending. Some mornings, she woke up expecting to feel Amara's tiny kicks beneath her ribs. Other times, she found herself reaching for the phone to call her obstetrician, only to remember there was no appointment to keep. The ache was constant, a hollow emptiness in her chest that no verdict, no sentence, could fill. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Malik asked one morning, handing her a cup of tea. His voice was gentle, cautious. She nodded. "I need to see him." Today, for the first time since sentencing, Lita would visit James Holbrook, now inmate number 402157, at Braxton State Penitentiary. She didn't know why she had agreed to the meeting. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was closure. Or maybe, deep down, she wanted to look him in the eye and understand how a human being could do something so monstrous and feel no remorse. The prison was a fortress of gray concrete and razor wire, cold and uninviting. Lita's heart pounded as she passed through the security checkpoints, clutching the visitor badge in her trembling hands. The guard led her down a sterile hallway and into a small, windowless room with 2 metal chairs and a pane of reinforced glass dividing them. James was already there. He looked different, thinner, paler, the arrogance gone from his face. Yet there was still something impenetrable in his expression, a wall she could not see through. He picked up the phone on his side of the glass. Slowly, reluctantly, Lita did the same. "Why are you here?" he asked, his voice low and hoarse. "I don't know," she admitted. "Maybe I want to hear you say you're sorry." He scoffed, a bitter, humorless sound. "Would it even matter?" "It might," she said softly. "Not for Amara. Nothing will ever bring her back. But for me." James stared at her for a long moment. His jaw tightened, and for a fleeting second, Lita thought she saw something like guilt flicker in his eyes. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "I was doing my job," he muttered. "It was chaos. I didn't mean for it to happen." Her grip tightened on the phone. "You kicked a pregnant woman, James. You kicked me. And you didn't even look surprised when I fell." He looked away, his gaze fixed on the blank wall. "I made a mistake." Lita exhaled, the weight of that word, mistake, crushing her. A mistake is spilling coffee. A mistake is forgetting someone's birthday. What you did was not a mistake. It was a choice. There was a long silence between them. Finally, James spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I see her sometimes. In my dreams." "Who?" "Your baby." The words pierced Lita's heart like a knife. She wanted to hate him, to scream at him, to curse his name. But instead, she felt something unexpected rising within her, pity. Not forgiveness, not even close, but a faint, hollow pity for a man who would live and die defined by the worst thing he had ever done. "I hope you see her every night," she said quietly. "I hope you never forget her name." And then she hung up the phone, stood, and walked out of the room without looking back. The weeks that followed were a blur of media interviews, vigils, and advocacy. Lita found herself at the center of a movement she had never intended to lead. Mothers who had lost children to police violence wrote her letters. Activists invited her to speak at rallies. Legislators reached out, asking for her input on new police accountability bills. Each time she stood before a crowd, she felt Amara's presence beside her, not as a ghost, but as a purpose. "My daughter's name was Amara," she told a packed auditorium one evening. Her voice steady and clear. She never took a breath, never opened her eyes. But she mattered. And if we are to honor her memory, we must demand a system where no mother has to bury a child because of someone else's rage. The crowd erupted in applause. Lita didn't smile, but she felt something stir in her chest, a fragile spark of strength. Meanwhile, James's days on death row ticked by slowly. He spent 23 hours a day in a cell barely larger than a closet. His appeals were filed and denied with brutal efficiency. Outside the prison walls, the debate raged on. Some believed his sentence was too harsh, others said it was too lenient. But inside, time moved differently. Each day was a countdown. Each sunrise another reminder that his life now had an expiration date. One cold February afternoon, James's sister, Clara, visited him. She hadn't spoken to him since the trial, unable to reconcile the brother she'd loved with the man who had taken a life. "I don't know how to feel about you anymore," she said through the glass. "Then don't," James replied. "You don't owe me anything. I keep thinking about that woman. About her baby." James swallowed hard. "I think about them too. Do you regret it?" He hesitated. "Every day." Clara pressed her hand against the glass. "Then say it. Out loud." James closed his eyes, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry. It was too late, of course." The apology would never reach the child he had taken. It might never reach Lita either. But it was the first honest thing he had said in months. Lita learned about the apology weeks later, through Clara herself, who reached out with a handwritten letter. He said he's sorry. "I don't expect you to forgive him, and I don't expect it to change anything. But I thought you should know." Lita read the letter 3 times before setting it down. Forgiveness was a complicated thing, a road she wasn't sure she wanted to walk. But something inside her shifted. The rage that had once consumed her was softening, transforming into something deeper, a determination to live a life that Amara would have been proud of. She visited the cemetery that evening, a bouquet of lavender in her hands. Kneeling beside the small white headstone engraved with her daughter's name, she whispered into the cold air, "I'm still angry, baby. I probably always will be. But I promise you this, your life will not be forgotten. I will carry you with me in everything I do." The wind rustled gently through the trees, and for the first time since that terrible day, Lita felt something close to peace. The date of James Holbrook's execution was set for May 12th, 1 year and 3 days after the kick that had changed everything. The city braced itself once again. Supporters of the death penalty called it justice served. Opponents called it state-sanctioned revenge. But for Lita, it was neither. It was simply the end of a story that had begun on a sidewalk with a single, terrible choice. And soon, it would be over. Spring returned to Braxton the following year with gentle rain and blossoms bursting from the cracks in the sidewalks. Life had a way of pushing forward, even when grief lingered like a shadow. For Lita Monroe, the seasons now marked not just the passage of time, but the distance between who she had been before and who she was now. A year ago, she had been preparing a nursery, folding baby clothes, dreaming of lullabies and bedtime stories. Today, she stood before a crowd of nearly 500 people at the dedication of the Amara Justice Center, a community hub she had helped build from the ground up. The center's mission was simple yet profound: to support mothers and families affected by police violence, provide free legal services, and advocate for systemic reform. It was funded in part by settlement money from her civil lawsuit against the city, money Lita had refused to spend on herself. "This place is for every parent who's ever been told their child's life didn't matter," Lita said into the microphone, her voice strong and unwavering. "It's for every woman who has been silenced, every family who has been broken. And it's for Amara, the little girl who taught me that love can be louder than hate." The audience erupted into applause. Some cried openly. Among them were mothers who had lost sons to police bullets, fathers who had buried daughters too soon, and children who would now grow up with opportunities their parents had only dreamed of. Lita stepped down from the podium and felt Malik's arms wrap around her. He whispered, "She would be proud." "I hope so," she said softly. In the months after James Holbrook's execution, Lita had wrestled with complicated emotions. There were days when she felt at peace, days when she felt nothing at all, and days when guilt crept in. Guilt for surviving. Guilt for still being alive when her daughter was not. Therapy helped. So did her advocacy work. But what truly began to heal her was the realization that grief was not a wound to be closed. It was a scar that would live with her forever, a testament to the love she still carried. She began speaking across the country, at universities, police academies, congressional hearings. She told Amara's story again and again, not to relive her pain, but to transform it into purpose. I don't want revenge, she told one audience. I want change. I want officers trained to see humanity before hostility. I want accountability when they abuse their power. And I want every mother, regardless of the color of her skin, to know that her child's life has value. Her words resonated. Laws began to shift. Departments implemented stricter protocols, independent oversight committees, and mandatory de-escalation training. It wasn't enough, not yet, but it was a start. One evening, nearly 18 months after losing Amara, Lita found herself sitting on a park bench near the river. The cherry blossoms were blooming, their petals drifting gently through the air. Children played nearby, their laughter carrying on the breeze. A woman approached and hesitated before speaking. "Excuse me, are you Lita Monroe?" Lita smiled faintly. "I am." The woman's eyes filled with tears. "My son, Terrence, he was shot by police 3 years ago. I never got justice. But what you've done, the laws you've helped pass, the center you built, it's given me hope." "Thank you." Lita's throat tightened. "I'm so sorry for your loss." The woman nodded, then pressed something into her hand. A small, hand-woven bracelet with the name Terrence stitched into the fabric. "For Amara," she said. When the woman walked away, Lita sat for a long time, staring at the river. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel alone in her grief. She was part of something bigger now, a movement of mothers, fathers, families refusing to let the world forget their children. Malik joined her a few minutes later, carrying 2 cups of tea. They sat together, in silence, watching the sunset paint the sky in soft pinks and golds. "Do you ever think about having another child?" he asked gently. The question caught her off guard. She had thought about it, late at night when the apartment was too quiet, when she caught herself lingering by the nursery door. But fear always crept in. What if it happened again? What if she couldn't love another child without breaking? "I do," she admitted. "But I'm scared." "So am I," Malik said, taking her hand. "But maybe that's okay. Maybe love and fear can exist together." She turned to look at him, and for the first time since Amara's death, the idea didn't terrify her. It didn't erase the past, and it didn't mean forgetting. It simply meant that life, stubborn, relentless life, still had more chapters to write. A year later, Lita stood once again in a hospital room. This time, the air was filled not with sirens and sorrow, but with the soft cries of a newborn baby boy. Tears streamed down her cheeks as the nurse placed him in her arms. "Hello, little one," she whispered, her heart overflowing. "Welcome to the world." They named him Emmanuel, meaning God is with us. And though nothing could ever replace Amara, his tiny heartbeat felt like a promise that healing was possible, that love could grow from the ashes of unimaginable pain. Lita pressed the locket against her chest, whispering into the quiet room. "You're still with me, baby girl. You always will be." Years later, the name Amara Monroe was taught in classrooms and written in law books. The Amara Justice Act, landmark legislation requiring nationwide police reform and independent investigations of officer-involved fatalities, passed with bipartisan support. The story of a mother's loss and a nation's reckoning became part of history. But for Lita, it was always personal. Every speech she gave, every life she touched, every law she fought for, it was all for her daughter. On the anniversary of Amara's due date, she visited the cemetery with Malik and Emmanuel. They brought balloons and wildflowers, and Lita read a letter she had written aloud. "My sweet Amara, I wish you were here to see the world you helped change. I wish I could tell you about the people who speak your name, about the children who are alive today because of you. You are gone, but you are everywhere, in every heartbeat, every law, every mother who refuses to give up. Thank you for giving me strength when I thought I had none. Thank you for guiding me. And thank you for teaching me that even in the darkest moments, love endures." She looked up at the sky, the afternoon sun warm on her face. Somewhere, she believed, Amara was smiling down on them. Lita walked away from the cemetery hand in hand with Malik and Emmanuel. The pain of her past would always be a part of her, but it no longer defined her. What defined her now was the future, a future built on love, justice, and the unbreakable bond between a mother and her child. And as the wind swept gently through the trees, she heard it, faint but unmistakable, a whisper carried through the branches, soft as a lullaby. I'm proud of you, Mama. Don't forget to share, like, subscribe our channel.